Hello everyone, and welcome to this video, which is in our Great Engine Endgame series. I'm Grandmaster Matthew Sadler, and we are taking a look at a fabulous endgame played by Stockfish against Komodo Dragon in the TCEC Season 22 SuperFinal Game 22. This is the ending that we're going to be looking at, and well, the contours of it were sort of formed when Stockfish took the queens off as early as move 8. When this happened, the chat went rather silent, unusually silent. After all, Stockfish was only giving the evaluation of about plus 0.9. Swapping off the queens this early against an engine that's as solid as Komodo, this was surely going to be a draw, right? But, you know, in the course of this queenless middle game, Stockfish managed to pick up a number of important positional advantages, long-term positional advantages. The first one came about after the move h4. Stockfish was expecting the tricky decision g takes h4, but to prevent white from playing this move, h5. And I didn't really appreciate its strength straight away, but you know, this pawn on h5, it ties down the pawn on h6. And if you imagine a scenario where this light squared bishop gets exchanged and white gets a knight on f5, then you can see that it's going to be a really big problem for black in the endgame. And here, you know, Stockfish's evaluation jumped up from about 0.9 to about plus 1.1, plus 1.2. The game was extremely complicated. We got some quite a lot of tension on the queen side there. But along the way, Stockfish managed to pick up the two bishops, crucially in actual fact, the light squared bishop, which undefends the square f5. And then at some stage, Stockfish swapped off its a pawn for black's f pawn, just letting it fracture the kingside pawn structure. And that basically led to the position that we've got here in front of us. And Stockfish was essentially at a plus 1.5 evaluation. However, it wasn't very clear at all how Stockfish was going to improve its position. We've got a great knight on f5, which ties down the bishop on f8 to the defense of the pawn on h6. But there are not really any pawn breaks for white. f4 is a little bit crazy, really. Looking at the black position, this active rook, the king, the knights, they really form an effective barrier to the white rook. You know, there's no easy entry points there. And the dark squared bishop can, you know, attack the pawn on e5, but it's well defended. So not necessarily that easy to think how we're going to proceed. I mean, also the white king, you know, doesn't have an easy path into the black position at all. So, I mean, when you've got positions like this, if you don't have any pawn breaks, the way that you're going to create entry channels is by exchanging off pieces, you know, diluting the defensive forces. And there's two possibilities for that. The first and perhaps the most interesting one would be to exchange off the dark squared bishops. Now, this dark squared bishop looks like black's bad bishop, and this dark squared bishop looks like white's good bishop, you know, the one not inhibited by the pawn chain. But as the Romanian grandmaster Mihai Suba once said, bad bishops defend good pawns, and this bishop is actually black's only defense of the h6 pawn. If it gets exchanged, black's going to lose h6. So, you know, it's not like it's easy to organize or anything, but, you know, in future play, if the chance comes up, white should definitely not avoid it. The other idea would be to swap off this light squared bishop for a knight, maybe with something like bishop e8, takes d7, and then also to exchange off possibly the rooks. You know, getting rid of this active rook and a knight would allow the white king to, to come into play. Which looks positive. The only thing is, you know, you're sort of wondering, well, where does the king go after that? Very hard to see. You know, it looks nice to activate the king like that, but very hard to see what it's going to do after. So, you know, that's definitely a possibility, but, you know, the contours of what you have to do aren't really clear yet. So I ran a lot of engine games from various positions within this endgame, and I have to say that the only engine that you could really trust, actually just as during the game, is Stockfish. None of the other engines really grasp the subtleties of this endgame in the same way. And one interesting thing, I was playing a lot of Stockfish against Stockfish matches. A long time controls on my 94 thread hardware, so comparable to TCEC. And well, Stockfish as white was winning a lot of games from Stockfish as black. So yeah, I'm sort of tending to think that, you know, perhaps this ending could be said to be technically winning, but well, obviously you need to be pretty good to realize it. So bishop c3 was what white played here. This is a very natural move. It's just attacking the pawn on e5, tying the knight down to d7. Now when I play bishop to e8, the knight can't move away because bishop takes c5 check. There's a lot of obvious points to it, but there's also something else that white is preparing that could very easily be overlooked. Now in this position, Komodo played rook a3, which we'll look at later. It led to a big evaluation jump for Stockfish, so sort of assumed that it was not a very good move at all. I'm sort of wondering though, because in actual fact the way that it ended up, Komodo basically chose the same defensive structure as well, Stockfish when it was playing this position as black. So, you know, I just get the feeling maybe that you know, this maybe accelerates stuff a little bit, but I'm not sure it's making any big difference. The move that I was thinking of, and actually it's the move that Stockfish as black was choosing a lot, was the move rook a8, and I just thought that it would stop white from playing the move bishop e8, and I was kind of thinking maybe we can just sort of stay like this and yeah, just wait to see what white is doing. And the amazing thing now is that white plays this move knight e3. Now, you know, if you've watched a lot of neural net games, you know, what you'll know is that the neural nets often make progress, or try to make progress, by shuffling their pieces around all their good different outposts. Well, here, you know, white's got a great outpost on f5 for the knight, but it's not, it's achieving something, but tying down the bishop on f8, but it's not decisive. So now Stockfish is going to move its knight round to c4, which is another great outpost for the knight, and well, you know, we'll see how that goes. Now, I had seen the idea, but I was only really focusing on the attack on the pawn on g7, which seemed, you know, trivial enough to deal with. But there's much more to it than that, because this knight on c4 not only attacks e5, it also supports the move bishop a5 check, and after that the black king is actually in rather a lot of trouble. And this is an absolutely wonderful way of trapping the black rook behind the bishop, inconveniencing the king, and, you know, maybe even starting to invade to get across to the h6 pawn. Let me just show you a game that Stockfish played against Stockfish. So, for example, if we go bishop e7, then we go knight c4, bishop f6, bishop a5 check, king b8, and bishop e8. And, well, rook d2 is next, and it's just going to be so hard to defend against this. After rook d2, we've even got rook d6, and we're attacking pawns on both sides of the board. And this knight is absolutely invulnerable, and these two are incredibly passive. So this is just absolutely winning. So in actual fact, in this position after knight e3, Stockfish as black played knight a4, hitting the bishop, bishop e1, and then knight a b6, transferring the knight from c5 to b6, in order to cover knight c4. The nice thing is, though, of course, is this shuffle, you know, this move of the knight back to e3, aiming for another outpost, has actually caused black to weaken its defensive structure. I mean, on b6 the knight stops knight c4, but for example it gives white's pieces a lot more freedom. The bishop can come to e6 now to threaten bishop takes d7, so we don't need the e8 square, and of course the rook even is directly attacking the c6 pawn. So it's a lovely example there of how shuffling, or even just threatened shuffling, can elicit a reaction from the opponent. Shows the power of neural net shuffling. Maybe another interesting continuation that we can show just at this point. Leela was playing knight b7. And actually what Leela was trying for all the time was to transfer its king over to the king side, somewhere like f6, to try and defend the pawn on e5 and also get in range of the h6 pawn. But you know, the downside to this sort of thing was simply that there's a lot of open squares all of a sudden on the queen side, you know, and a lot of entry points. And I mean, it's absolutely crucial. If the rook gets onto the 7th rank, you're going to be in such big trouble. And black just doesn't have the resources to stop it. So bishop a5 is a nice move. If rook a5, then rook b6. And after knight d7, bishop b4, looking for the exchange of those dark squared bishops. Even though the black king's close to the king's side, it can't defend h6. And, well, we got this position. And actually, it's one of those surprising things, really, that I've seen lots of positions like this where black manages to get at the f3 pawn and white takes the h6 pawn. And this just turned out to be really good for white, because it's not so easy for black to get at these pawns. And, of course, this h pawn in the long term is just a runner. And, well, how did the game go? Not particularly understandable in some ways, but check, 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 h6. Rook h3, king e2, and black couldn't take this g4 pawn because we go h7, and then rook c8 check and h8 queen. So, yeah, you know, I mean, it's these positions pretty difficult. But this plan of, you know, running the king over to the king's side, not particularly good, I'm afraid, just because there are just too many entry points that the black can't cover. So after bishop c3, Komodo went rook a3, which was rather stimulating knight e3 because, I mean, knight c4 is going to come in with tempo now. So knight a4 was played by Komodo, bishop a5 check, that disruptive move, king b7, king e2, defending the knight, defending the pawn, preparing to come to c4, and now we get knight a b6 again. And that's what I mean, that, you know, yeah, I mean, the evaluations changed quite a bit, but I'm not really sure that that this was a bad move at all. Bad sequence at all from Komodo. Komodo just ends up with what Stockfish set up as black in my engine games. So bishop c3, and it's around this point actually that in the games that I was playing with Leela against Stockfish, that Leela started to make a few wins. Up till now 0, but now a few wins, although not consistently. You know, it's so bishop c5. And now knight f5. And what Stockfish is doing quite beautifully in the next few moves is really optimizing its position to the maximum before it carries on with the next stage of plan. And you know, the point is, Stockfish's evaluations were so high at this moment already. I think it was maybe already seeing stuff like the Zugzwangs that we're going to win the game later. And well, I mean, that's just simply incredible. And that was just like, you know, a level that's you know, that's just yeah, 200, 300 elo ahead of any of the other engines. You know, really very impressive. So, you know, having threatened to shuffle to c4, one of its outposts, it goes back to the main one and ties the bishop back to the h6 pawn. Bishop b2, rook a4, and now rook c1. And this is a very good idea. The rook is getting into contact with the a1 square, so white is actually going to be able to exchange off the rooks. King c7, bishop e6. So the bishop getting in contact with the knight here, and just ready to take the knight on d7. Rook a8, rook d1, tying down the king and the knight to the defense of the knight on d7. Rook a6, and now a really excellent move that shows how deeply Stockfish had calculated. King d2, rook a4, king c2, placing this king optimally for the coming endgame that it's going for. And well, we'll explain why the king is really good on c2 and why it has to be there. But yeah, you know, for now, I mean, I was looking at this live with many other chatters, and yeah, you know, I mean, I can see, you know, the general point, but I just didn't understand at all why this was important. So here, this was one of the games that Leela won. I mean, against Stockfish, actually, rook a6 was played, and Leela came up with an interesting plan, actually. It came up with the idea of not of swapping anything off, but of playing this idea, knight c4. It's very well timed in actual fact. Knight takes c4, I'll go rook takes d7, and I'm threatening this move knight takes c5. And after rook e8, bishop c3, white's simply going to play knight d6 check at some stage, and after taking, the h6 pawn will be gone. And that's pretty much what happened here. Takes, rook f8, rook c6, king b5, rook h6. Black takes on on f3, but with two bishops and a passed h pawn, this was just way too much. So that was actually a very interesting way of playing. But Stockfish's way of playing was actually much more instructive and much more thematic, really. So rook a8 was played, rook a1 now. Takes, king b7, and takes. And knight e3 from Stockfish. And Stockfish's evaluation was already at +6 or +7 here. But funnily enough, this is the moment that Leela starts again drawing games and failing to win games. It's only you've got to go about 6 or 7 moves deeper, start the endgame from there, and then Leela's managing to win this. So what are White's advantages here? Well, obviously we've got really two weaknesses here: e5 and h6. The question is, how do you put maximum pressure on that, and how do you invade with your pieces? Actually, Stockfish has got a key square in mind for its for its knight, and it's not at all an obvious one, but we see it in this line. Bishop g7 was my move. None of the engines wanted to play that, but I go knight c4, king a6, bishop b2, king b5, knight d6 check, king b4. Pretty common way of well, not a bad defense for black in principle, just trying to keep the king around b4, a4, and try and stop the white bishop from coming into a3 to e7 or f8. But we play knight to f7 in this position, and particularly with the bishop on g7, this is very, very painful for black. This knight attacks h6 and e5, so it ties down both of black's pieces, and actually neither of them have got any moves. I mean, it's real, yeah, there's really not much that that black can do here. So king a4 is it was one idea. I just point out one silly little line, but if you go c5, for example, I could play bishop c3, and after king c4 I've got knight d6 checkmate. So yeah, trying to keep the white king bottled up is really, really difficult. So king a4 was my Leela Stockfish game. King c3, bishop f8, king c4. If you go bishop g7, I go knight d8. I'm going to force this pawn to move forward and then invade with the king. And if you go knight b6, I go king d3, and then this pawn is gone. And well, these positions were ending up winning for white. It was quite slightly fraught game. Black does get some counterplay here with its c pawn, but at the end of the day, this was winning through for white. I'll just show you the a few more moves: e5, e6, e7, c2, check, king a2, queen b3, knight c4, and there was this lovely domination of the black queen. f3, king f3, and white just moved the king up to g6 here, and ended up winning this pawn. Quite not easy this, but if you spot this idea of putting the knight on f7, the rest will become clear, I think. But the engines were playing bishop d6, and what's the idea of that? The idea is simply to try and anticipate white. If this knight goes to f5, the bishop goes back to f8. If this knight comes to c4, the bishop comes to c7, and we're stopping the knight getting into d6 and thus into f7. So knight c4, bishop c7, we get a little bit of shuffling because that's what Stockfish does. Bishop b2, king a6, and now bishop a3. And this is where Leela starts winning games again somehow. So what are we aiming for? Obviously what we're doing, we're exploiting the fact that the bishop's not on f8, and we're trying to invade. And once you start invading, you even get ideas like bishop takes g5, and of course with a bishop on e7, that's a big blocker to this dark squared bishop. So then we can just simply look at returning the knight to f5 and then winning the h6 pawn. So c5 is necessary, but black is weakening the light squares there. So if this white king can get active now, if it comes to c4, we've got invasion channels. I mean, that's the big point about it. I mean, I said before that bringing the king to c4, what can you do really? What sort of invasion channel? Well, this is the first stage of the plan. Play the bishop to a3, force this c6 to c5, and now we've got invasion channels. So knight goes back to e3, bishop d6, we get a little bit more shuffling, and then king b3. king b5, bishop c1. So yeah, what can black do here? Komodo kept on going with the passive defense. I mean, if you go for activity, this was Leela against Stockfish. Obviously, Stockfish as black knew exactly what was in store for it. We go knight f5, knight d4, king c3, bishop a5 check, king b2. Managed to chase the king away, but we go knight takes h6 here, and yeah, simply this pawn is a runner. Leela converted this without too much difficulty. So king a6 played by Komodo, just staying passive. Bishop d2, king b5, bishop c3. So Stockfish just taking its time, just lining up with bishop and knight on the pawn on e5, tying these two down. And basically, Stockfish has got Komodo's only got moves with his king. Now a very nice move, knight a3. Relinquishing some pressure on d7, but also preparing the king's entry there. So bishop d6 was played, bishop a1. If still we got a defense here of king c4, there's knight b6 check. So bishop a1, bishop f8, knight c4, bishop g7. And now knight d6, bishop f8, and knight f7. So we have got onto our ideal square, attacking e5 and attacking h6 here. And what we're also threatening, if you go bishop g7, I just go king c4, and knight b6 will go king c5. If you're wondering why did white go bishop a1 all those moves ago, this was the idea, simply that after king c5 you don't have a knight a4 check, forking a bishop on b2 and a king on c5. So king b5 here, and you could already start grabbing pawns, but well, Stockfish isn't particularly interested in that. It wants its full pound of flesh, the full zugzwang basically. So king c6 was played in this position. If c4 check, king c2, king c5, king d2, king b5, bishop b2. The idea simply again is to come round to a3. You've played c4 check, you've destroyed this barrier, so we're just going to be looking for bishop a3 into e7, and then something like knight d6 to f5. Yeah, this move c4 is not great. So black was actually a number of games. This is Stockfish against Leela. Leela was just giving up the pawn. Stockfish was thinking twice about taking it and then taking this one, and then the whole process starts again. We go to e3, we go to f5, and eventually the black position collapses. So bishop c3, king c6. And now a couple of ideas. I mean, Leela was coming in with king a4 here, knight b6, king a5, knight c4, king a6, which is pretty tough to defend against. Yeah, again, this knight, this bishop, they can't actually move. This knight paralyzes the bishop on g7. So black has to move the king, and then we go king b5 and pick up the pawn, and then later some more pawns as well. So that was possible. Stockfish chose a very nice way of playing it. Bishop a5, king b5, bishop c7. It's beautifully thematic as well. And, we're just tying up black completely. And if black just stays passive and just moves the king, we just wait a little bit, and then we play bishop e7. And what's white's follow-up here? Well, we're completely paralyzing the bishop on g7 with the bishop on e7. So if you go knight b6, for example, I go knight d6, and then the knight comes to f5. And yeah, you just cannot keep the bishop on g7, which means that the h6 pawn goes, and then afterwards the g5 pawn, and then the pawns just run. So this is complete, complete and utter domination in actual fact. Knight f8 was tried by Komodo, and then we got this takes, knight e5, knight e6, king c2, knight d4, king d3, and again, these endings don't get any easier. We've got ideas like knight f7 takes h6, or we've even got simply the idea of f4, and after gf, then g5, hg, h6, with yeah, just queening. So knight e6 was played, f5, knight f4, king c2, blocking the c pawn, and the f7 pawn is prepared to run. and this game did not last a long time. So, looking at that game, I mean, this looks, yeah, so smooth. How on earth was there a chance to defend this? Probably not with perfect technique. But what I want to get back to actually is this moment that I, raved about, which was here having, optimized all of its minor pieces and the rook as well. White made sure that its king came to c2 before it actually did anything. And this was important because in a number of my engine games, when white didn't take that precaution, then we actually ended up in some slightly difficult situations. King to b5. This was a game Leela against Stockfish. And after bishop d7, knight d7, what's the difference in this position between what we've seen already? It's that the black king is on b5, and that king is really, really active. And it's so active, in fact, that it's going to stop the white king from doing anything itself. If we go king b3, we just go knight c5 check. King c3, we go back to d7. If you go bishop b2 to try and get in bishop a3 later, I go king a4, and you're not going to be able to get that. And king c4, I go knight b6 check. Now, I'm not saying that this is, that it isn't possible that I would still lose this as a human player in this position. But in actual fact, my engine games were ending up drawn from these positions. Simply, this king being active enough on b5 in order to restrict the white king and thus be able to chase it back. And of course, very importantly, avoiding this move c6 to c5, which opens up entry channels for the white king. Another interesting position was this one that I reached in a Stockfish against Stockfish game. And here we see that black has been forced to play c6 to c5, but again the king is very, very active here. And well, if the white king was on b3, we'd have the position in the game, which turned out to be winning. But it's a little bit tricky to do this because after, well, bishop c3, bishop b8, bishop b2, bishop c7, a little bit of shuffling there from Stockfish, and then king c3. The king's coming over to b3 to get the ideal structure. Then you can go knight a3 check to chase back the king. But we play knight b6. And after knight a3, remember, now that the king's on c3, it's no longer attacking the e5 pawn. We play knight f3, king to c6, and the slightly frightening thing about it is that if you play a move like king d3, bishop b8, knight c4, then this position is actually a draw. Stockfish goes straight away to 0.00, and I think we'll trust it for these endgames. So also, if you don't play king c3, if you just go knight a3, then the king doesn't retreat. The king comes forward to b4, and again, it's still very, very difficult for white to get the structure that it wants. And that, of course, is why it was such a good move when Stockfish played king d2 and king c2 in its game, because then the king's ready to come to b3 all the time. Even if black manages to rush the king to b5, then the king's on b3, perfectly where it should be. So there we are. That was it, basically. I think probably one of the most impressive queenless middle games I've ever seen. I mean, it's exchanging the queens at move 8, Ulf Anderson style, and then beating a 3600 ELO rated engine in an incredibly smooth style. Picking up positional advantages along the way, and then from this static position with big advantages for white, just grinding it all the way in a inexorable, relentless way, and of course, having watched it live, having seen it all unfold, and been quite confused as to, is this winning, is this not? Hell of an experience, and really impressive game. I mean, what are my takeaways from this? I suppose really it's the what I liked most was the care that Stockfish took in optimizing all of its pieces before going for the end game. And yeah, again, I think probably just a good basic position to have in your head about this is probably just winning. But and some of the techniques that Stockfish uses, hopefully they'll stick as well in my mind and in yours as well. So there we are. I hope you enjoyed that. If you liked the video, why not give a like or subscribe to the channel? Always glad to see more subscribers, and then you can keep up to date with the content. And so far I've been doing a video a day for I don't know how long, and well, still intending to, still enjoying it. Otherwise, maybe take a look at my book, The Silicon Road to Chess Improvement. Chock-a-block full of great analysis of engine games and amazing tips for how to work with them. And otherwise, thanks very much for watching this video. Hope to see you at the next one. Thanks for watching.